next day. We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to this Thursday edition of The Chiefs, and of course with us is Ana Marie Pamintuan, the editor-in-chief of the Philippine Star. Hi, Ami. And unfortunately, Luchi Cruz Valdez and Robbie Alampai will not be joining us tonight. Ami, hi. What's your big story tonight for tomorrow?
Well, bago yung Human Rights Day, of course, yung sa vaccine pa rin, the government is promising that there will be no graft sa pag-procure ng vaccines, and of course, yung warning ng Pfizer, which slightly lang naman dampened enthusiasm for its vaccine. Yung warning for people with severe allergic
reactions.
Yes. Kasama ako ron, kaya hindi ako pwede ng vaccine nila.
And when you mentioned yung guarantee ng gobyerno that the vaccine importations will be clean, I suppose you're referring to reports that some Sinovac officials were guilty or admitted of having taken part in bribery in previous years. Of course, not in reference to this vaccine, but to previous vaccines.
Previous years. That's it. That's the report of the Washington Post. Huh?
Yeah, the Washington Post.
Anyway, yung mga officials natin are, of course, saying they're investigating, but it's not related nga to the COVID vaccine, but they're going to look into it. Nakalagi naman yung pinapangako nila, no corruption lang. Yun nga, yung na-hack yung Pfizer, merong information na na-hack na may mga nakuha yata, although Pfizer is not talking. Pfizer and BioNTech yung sa Europe, yun. Yan yung mga dinapantay natin yan. And of course, the rallies on Human Rights Day. And
there were several rallies in Mindiola.
Yes. And yung arrest niya na nabanggit mo na sa umpisa natin, so maybe we should bring in our guests.
Yeah, there were at least 2 notable arrests today, this morning, and we can talk about that, among other things, with our first guest for tonight. We are bringing in Carlos Conde, the Asia Division Senior Researcher for the group, the New York-based group Human Rights Watch. Kaloy, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Good evening, Anne-Marie.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Hi, good to see you again.
Yes.
Well, Kaloy, we do want to ask you about the big picture, about the human rights situation in the Philippines, going to the 5th year of the Duterte administration. But let me start off with this. First of all, 3 days ago, the Department of Justice hosted the Human Rights Summit, where the President Duterte himself, said in his speech that he is seriously committed to prioritizing human rights. Number 2, that the work is far from over in boosting human rights issues. And number 3, that summit that he took part in was an effective platform for international community to enhance cooperation in protecting human rights. Now, I bring up these points so that I could ask you, what do you make of these specific points made by the President just 3 days ago?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's good that the President is starting to discuss the positive aspect of human rights, because in previous statements, he has nothing but contempt for human rights and human rights advocates. But to put it bluntly, Ed, that all of that is just talk. I mean, we have to really, include in the picture the action of this government, of the people in this government, with regard to human rights, and it doesn't match. The action and the talk does not match. So, while we are happy that the President makes such a commitment, the fact is that his government, going into the 5th year, has been nothing but human rights catastrophe for a lot of Filipinos.
I suppose kasi we seem to be looking at some sort of mixed signaling. Kasi just less than a month ago, in one of his addresses, late night addresses, the President was again lambasting human rights groups. And in fact, in the United Nations General Assembly, the President slammed his critics for what he called weaponizing human rights.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much as mixed messaging by the President. I think this is a deliberate attempt try to confuse the public and to make it seem like they are committed to human rights, but at the same time their actions belie that. So it's double talk. It is not sincere, and we've seen the death toll since June 2016, July 2016, and it's growing every day in the drug war and all these other sorts of violations that we've seen in the past 4 years or so. So it's my other take on Mr. Duterte is that usually he talks about things depending on who's in front of him. So if he's in front of United Nations people or diplomats, he will say all the right things. But if he's alone with his probably advisor or in front of the media, he will perorate against human rights. So it's a very inconsistent, as I say, kalat. But at the same time, there's a method in that pagiging kalat, which is that it undermines human rights in general.
Kalo, you mentioned that he's into his fifth year. You don't think there will be a genuine effort on, if not on his part, on the part of some of his aides, some of his officials, to improve their adherence, the administration's adherence to human rights? Matatapos na tong administration na to eh. And you don't think that people will be wondering if there will be hell to pay after these 6 years are over?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, Ana Maria. But again, the fact is that there are people in the bureaucracy in government who are mindful and respectful of human rights, and they try as much as they can to work within the system to try to uphold human rights. But the fact is that the reality is that this is a policy from the top. To violate the human rights of people is a policy from the top. So they cannot, they're having difficulty to try to do their mandate because the president himself is very clear that he doesn't care about human rights and that you just keep, killing people. Just last month he ordered the police to shoot first. Rhetoric like that. So kahit na may mga magagaling or magagandang loob na mga empleyado sa gobyerno na gustong gawin yung trabaho nila for human rights, mahirapan sila because the mandate is from the top.
Are you feeling any change in the Philippine National Police, for example, or in the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency? They're saying that they're using body cameras now. They're more aware of the rights of suspects. Are you actually feeling those changes? We're talking about the war on drugs, which is the centerpiece of the administration from the start.
There's hardly any change that we've detected, Ana Maria. For one thing, the drug war killings and the raids and all these extrajudicial killings related to the drug operations, they're continuing on a daily basis. It hasn't stopped. The death toll of the drug war is increasing, and we're just talking about killings by the police. We're not including the killings by unidentified gunmen who might be also working for the police. So, the Philippine National Police cannot claim that it has improved its human rights adherence. The fact that the new PNP chief right now is a general who has quite a I would say questionable history on human rights when he was assigned in the Central Philippines, bodes ill for human rights in the country right now. And if you go back to and if you look at the behavior of the police in recent months, in terms not just of the drug war, but look at what's happening today. Sweepers of activists and journalists, and before that, all of these arrests and mistreatment of political prisoners. It's I don't see any improvement. Now they're saying that they're adhering to the law, but that's small comfort because we're not seeing it. But finally, on that point, I think the best barometer, the best measure of any improvement by the police on their adherence to human rights is if they're investigating and actually actively prosecuting police officers who are implicated in human rights violation. But we're not seeing that. Keep in mind, only one case has resulted in a conviction out of tens of thousands.
Yes. Okay.
No, Kalay, we all knew from the very start, even before the president, even before Duterte took office in Malacanang, we knew about his position with regard to human rights, and he does seem to have been consistent about this position with human rights. I'm wondering, lang, in the last 5 years, has there been any? Have you noticed any change in the way his government has been handling the issue of human rights? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? I ask that because, for example, this year we have seen the rise in what you might call red tagging among other
Yeah.
things. So
Well-
are we seeing an improvement or are we seeing a worsening of the situation?
Well, generally, I would say there's a worsening of the situation, but also, to be fair, the government has engaged with the international community when at the Human Rights Council in October, for instance. It succeeded in convincing the Human Rights Council and the member states to to pretty much go easy on the Philippines. So that in a way that is good news because they're engaging, unlike the rhetoric with the president and subsequent action when the Philippines got out of the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. So at least you can see that more than just spewing disinformation against the human rights movement and against activists documenting the human rights violation, they are engaging the international community. Of course, the quality of that engagement remains to be seen. We have a lot of issue with the quality of that engagement, but at least they're not shutting down the door completely. But again, you pointed out that for instance, in the matter of red tagging, it has worsened. It has the attacks on civil society has worsened. The constricting of the democratic space is really intensifying. You have this arrest, you have questionable arrest by the authorities, and you have the continuing assault on indigenous peoples in the countryside. And right now, the introduction of the anti-terrorism law is really it presents a very, very complicated dilemma or a problem for the human rights movement because this law is going to be misused by the government against dissenters, against activists, and we're seeing that right now.
Okay, but the implementation is not yet even in full swing. So once it kicks into high gear, are you looking at an intensification of that problem?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to look at the anti-terrorism law as a partnership with, it works in tandem with the National Task Force on Ending Local Communist Insurgency. The anti-terrorism law will be used against progressive element, the activists from the left, not so much the usual, extremist groups that were the target of anti-terror law in the past. But this is going to be used for or against activists, and this will be misused against the activists. And our fear is that because the law is so broad, the law is so, it gives so much power to the Anti-Terrorism Council to designate anybody as a terrorist. That is a very, very problematic aspect of the law. Just, warrantless arrest, you can be held without charges for up to 24 days. That's really scary, if you ask me.
Yes. Well, Kaloy, the government has said that they will actually use the terror law against certain groups that are being red tagged. But anyway, I think the president thinks he can get away with it because of all these surveys showing that he still enjoys a phenomenal support if you go by the numbers.
Yeah.
Wala naman nagki-questionan. But do you think we're just about a year and a half away from the elections? You think people will want a continuation of these policies? Is it a support, these surveys? Do you think it's a support for these policies actually, for the drug war, for the his policies on human rights? And do you think it will continue beyond 2022?
Well, a few things there. We have to unpack some of that. There's no denying that President Duterte is extremely popular. It's a mind-boggling popularity.
Yes.
I don't think there's any other leader in the world who has that kind of popularity.
Yes.
But look, will this continue? I think there are a few things here. One is that as long as the international accountability mechanisms like the ICC and the Human Rights Council and the international community will not act, will not act decisively on what's happening in the Philippines, I mean, it will be business as usual. And as long as I think, the popularity, as long as there is no alternative, as long as the political opposition is in disarray, as long as people feel that nobody else is offering alternatives to the problems that Mr. Duterte has been claiming, then it will continue. So this is a failure of politics in general, I think, and unfortunately for a lot of Filipinos, and we know this. They look for alternative, and right now they're not seeing a lot. All they're seeing are groups like ours, activists, rallying in the streets, and which the government can easily dismiss. But they're not seeing anything from, for instance, the political opposition, from the institutions that can offer a viable alternative to Mr. Duterte's policies. I mean, I'm not just talking about him being popular. It's just the policies. I mean, the democratic institutions of the country right now are so damaged, are so undermined, that nothing seems to be coming out of there that would compel Mr. Duterte to change course.
But Kala, you also work with the grassroots. Aren't you sensing any fatigue among the masses? For example, they're being targeted also now with human rights violations. Are you not sensing any fatigue developing, which might lead to a change in 2022, a swing to someone different?
Well, it's not so much fatigue. I mean, on the contrary, this is probably a biased view from my end, but we see a lot of these ordinary folks from the grassroots really riled up by all the injustice they're seeing. If you go to the communities, to the urban poor communities where a lot of these drug war killings happen, you will detect a lot of worry, a lot of cry for justice. But at the same time, there's fear. There's this sense that nothing will work in their favor. As long as Mr. Duterte is there. So you have an environment, again, with a democratic space that's constricting, social media that's dominated by trolls, that prevents ordinary people, from speaking out, from expressing what they really think. I mean, that's a problem. So again, to the credit of the activists, they're really doing their best to try to educate people, or to open the eyes of people about the realities, the human rights realities that they're facing. But they're up against a hugely popular president, and who has a very large following, and so it is quite a predicament for for the masses, as you said.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kaloy, let me ask you about what you think of this in the long term. Your long view about this. I mean, I think we all agree that we'd like to think of human rights as something that is universally accepted in terms of principles that people can stand on and can stand with and should even defend. However, what do you think will be the impact of the last 5 years and going to the 6th year? With Duterte in government, in power, and he's talking about human rights. What do you think will be his impact in the long term on how everybody here in this country views the concepts of human rights? We're talking about the police, the military, and even the public.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ed. And I think the last 5 years we've seen the diminution of human rights as a concept, as a principle, as something that actually can be tangible in the lives of people. We have seen how human rights as an idea, as a movement in a liberal democracy, is being assaulted by those in power. And so, I think the damage of the last 5 years to human rights is huge. And I think also the damage to the democratic institutions that do not only work to uphold human rights, but also to make democracy work. We're talking about the judiciary, we're talking about the legislature, we're talking about the police and the security forces. That's going to really, the past 5 years is going to really affect how they're going to perform in the moving forward. And that brings me actually to this study that was done by some researchers, which said that a lot of local politicians decided to support, particularly those from outside of the
Yes, yes.
network of the usual political networks are supporting Duterte because they thought that that presented them with an opportunity to enjoy the political largesse, the support and support from the government. And I agree with that assessment, but also uh, my view about that is that it actually creates this new generation of politicians who I call the mini Dutertes, who are so very concerned about towing the Duterte line of not of making sure that they enforce a drug war, that they making sure that they follow what he says, and because they think that doing that will not only protect them from a possible, a lot of the mayors, as we know, are being put in narco lists. And so, following the mandate of the drug war they hope, will prevent that from happening to them. And also, of course, the resources that would come if they pursue or prosecute the drug war. But and also, finally, on that point, the popularity and the charisma that somehow rubs off on them when they support Duterte and his drug war. They calculate that by supporting Duterte, they will also be not as popular as him, but popular enough to remain in power for a very, very long time. And so there's going to be a generation of political leaders in the Philippines who are very, very steeped in what has been called Dutertismo. And that is actually quite scary, if you ask me.
Well, I asked the question because you can even see it on social media, and I'm not even talking about people who are in positions or people who are in power or people who are in the security forces. I'm talking about ordinary people who seem to have taken that narrative that you can only have a dichotomy of some sort. It's always it's always the law or the law versus human rights defenders, and that if you uphold human rights, you are upholding the rights only of rapists and drug pushers. There seems to have been that narrative that developed in the last 5 years.
Yeah, that narrative has been perfectly communicated by the president himself and by his people. I mean, it's a whole setup. It's part of the whole. It's like a grooming kind of thing when you are depicting one sector or one section of the population as deserving of this type of violence. And he's been doing that for even before he won as president. Even during the campaign in 2015, he was already doing that. And look, President Duterte came into power, came into the picture. He did not have to mislead people about what he intended to do. He was very upfront about it. And he was very, very clear about what he wanted to do, which is to kill a lot of people. And that's exactly what has happened. This happened in Davao, and this is happening now all over the country. And so, that is the kind of populist political. I wouldn't call it an ideology, but that is the kind of perspective that resonates with a lot of people, with the people that have been suffering from the dysfunction of the Philippine political culture. People that have borne the brunt, for instance, of the dysfunction of the state security forces, of the police, of the judiciary. So it's a perfect mix of dysfunction.
Yeah, but Kaloy, if I may interject, there are some bright spots. I mean, I've seen some bright spots. For example, I saw one post of one army colonel, and he's an active duty colonel. He has engaged in combat. He posted lang kanina every day is Human Rights Day.
Well, well, that's good. That they're saying that. I mean, you want to change things on the ground, you start with a conversation. That's good. But again, I go back to my earlier point, which is that you always have to, particularly on human rights, you always have to weigh it by the words and by the action. I mean, because these are not, you say you respect and uphold human rights, but at the same time, all these things are happening. So it's not just an opinion. It's the fact is that human rights is very, very crucial to a democracy. Human rights is an integral part of the way we live as a people. And if you derogate that, if you assault that, then you're looking at a problem. No matter how you profess that you observe human rights every day, and you may very well have been doing that, as a colonel, as a as somebody in power in the military. I won't deny you or begrudge you your own way of observing human rights. But again, looking at it from the broader picture, looking at it from the policy picture, then you have a problem. It just doesn't match. There's a disconnect.
Okay. And
Okay, I have one more question. Kalay, wait. I have one more question. There's a constant criticism being leveled against people in the human rights field, that legal activism and the issues of human rights are being used and abused by people in the rebel movement.
Okay.
What do you say to that?
Well, that's a terrific question. I think that goes to the heart of all this debate or this discussion, not a debate, on red tagging. I think people need to realize that just because, for instance, you're a communist doesn't mean you're an enemy. It doesn't mean that your rights cease to exist. Keep in mind, communism is not illegal in this country. Being an activist, being leftist is not illegal. Everybody has a right to be a communist. Everybody has a right to be a leftist. The same way that anybody has the right to become a fascist, But the question really boils down to, are these people doing anything illegal against the law? Because the only way you can punish a communist and send him to jail or arrest him is if he is actually actively fighting as a combatant the government. And in many of these arrests, in many of these cases, especially, for instance, the ones that we see today, that's not the case. So there's a huge argument about these arrests being illegal because the evidence are trumped up. And the Philippine authorities, they have almost zero credibility that every time they do this, they will be questioned, that they will be accused of planting evidence, because there have been instances in the past, and even in the drug war, where planting of evidence was common. And again, back to your question, Ed, any Filipino has the right to rebel. Any Filipino has the right to be a communist, has the right to be a fascist, whatever. But your rights cease to exist in a way. You become a criminal or you violate the law when you take up arms, when you actively fight the government as a combatant. And even then, when you go in the mountains and fight the government, the soldiers, in a combat situation, you still enjoy rights the same way that the soldiers enjoy the protection of international humanitarian law. So these are called the rules of war. In a war situation, both sides have human rights, have rights that needed to be protected, and that is important to illustrate, I think.
Okay. Carlos Conde, the Asia Division Senior Researcher for the group Human Rights Watch. Kaloy, thank you again for joining us tonight.
thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Anna Marie. Good night.
Good evening.
We will just go into a break, so please stay with us.
Napaka na po ng camera and mic. Thank you po.
Welcome back to the Chiefs. We're now in the final stage of our conversation. And now we'd like to welcome Brigadier General Ildebrandi Usana, spokesperson for the Philippine National Police. Good evening, General. Welcome po to the Chiefs.
Hi, sir.
Sir,
Good evening po.
Opo, Human Rights Watch po, Human Rights Today and International Human Rights Day. And in recent weeks, naririnig po natin si Presidente Duterte at yung mga official niya committing to the international community the administration's commitment to uphold human rights. Pero sabi pa ng Human Rights Watch kanina, mukhang wala naman actually pagbabagay. It's actually looking like it's getting worse into the future of the president. Naalala ko po yung noong umpisa, nag-utos sa PNP na magbigay ng mga guidelines on how to adhere to human rights. Kayo po bilang the main enforcer of laws, kumusta na po yung program nyo ngayon sa police for respecting human rights?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for inviting us here, ma'am. Well, insofar as the Philippine National Police is concerned, we have been doing this for the longest time as regards the advocacy that we need to do insofar as human rights protection is concerned. And I guess at no time in our history the Philippine National Police has been really pursuing its cause for the respect, protection, and promotion of human rights. In fact, around the world, you cannot even find any unit in their law enforcement institution that is dedicated to addressing human rights except the Philippine National Police. And you also have the Armed Forces of the Philippines that has its own human rights office that is also pursuing its cause insofar as international humanitarian law is concerned. And we feel that we have been doing our level best. There really are imperfections, and we cannot avoid this in any human endeavor. But we hope that our countrymen will be able to understand that deep inside our institution, we have been doing our level best to address issues and concerns as regards protection of human rights. If there are violations that may have been committed by our police officers, the PNP leadership does not condone this. And those acts that are being committed by our erring police officers are being subjected to automatic or motu proprio investigation from the Internal Affairs Service. And if there are violations being committed indeed, then they will be facing sanctions. And of course, if we speak of data, we have had many of these cases that have resulted in the dismissal of our police officers who have violated a lot of things. And we look at this at the perspective of the rule of law. So long as you are compliant with the rule of law, then there is certainly no violation of human rights. Conversely, if you actually have been not compliant with what the rules provide, then there certainly are violations of human rights. And these are the things that we have been injecting into consciousness of our police officers. And under no circumstances are we going to condone any of the acts that are inimical to the police service. And we have many applicants in the police service, and we cannot even allow any minute longer for any erring police officer to stay and commit infractions of law and besmirch the reputation of the PNP as a public service institution.
So, General, to what do you attribute all these negative, do you call them perceptions or reports, There are complaints against the administration before international bodies, the foreign media, and even local media. They are criticizing the human rights abuses in the Philippines. To what do you attribute this? Are these just perceptions? Is that what you're saying?
Well, not only that, I guess the narrative coming from those who are bent on destroying the government's efforts seems to really sort of find anything that is wrong so far as what the government is doing. Yet we have to understand that human rights is not only about what the police is doing. It's not only about simple law enforcement. It's a huge perspectives of how we view human rights across uh, the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And I guess if we are to equate human rights as only referring to what the police or what the law enforcement is doing, we have a problem there. And the narrative must also speak about what the president has actually done insofar as pursuing the cause of human rights. He has, in fact, enacted a lot of laws that pave the way for the protection of humans, especially of the poor. And I guess this must also be given appropriate recognition in the international community. And speaking of the international community, no less than the United Nations has recognized the efforts of the Philippines insofar as the pursuit of human rights. It may not be perfect, but at least we have been doing our level best. And as a result, they have been extending, the UN system has been extending some sort of a technical cooperation as well as capability building for our government authorities to help us out in order for us to fulfill further what needs to be done as far as human rights protection is concerned.
Sir, we do acknowledge that the PNP and the AFP, they both have human rights offices, and I suppose that is unusual compared to other countries where their security forces do not have a human rights office. And I also understand that you were formerly the chief of the PNP Human Rights Office.
That's right, sir.
Yes, sir. That's good, sir. Anyway, sir, but what I wanted to ask you was this: how do you reconcile po your stated commitment? I mean, the PNP's stated commitment towards human rights and the respect for human rights, with, for example, the president's consistent attacks on human rights concepts and human rights advocates. I mean, it's no secret to anybody in this country that the president likes to belittle human rights. Sometimes, yes, he says that it's important, but most of the time, in public statements, he has repeatedly hit human rights. So, how do you reconcile that? Po?
Well, I cannot practically speak for and on behalf of the president, sir, but insofar as law enforcement is concerned, he actually has been telling us you just comply with what the laws provide. And true enough, that is what we have been doing. Of course, the coercive nature of our work suggests that some people really wouldn't even understand, much less appreciate what we actually are doing for the best interest of the greater number of people. But because of our role to enforce the law, we just have to carry out what needs to be done in order for us to maintain law and order, peace, and of course, making our people feel that indeed they can work and do business in and find the opportunity for other people to live a happy life, I guess. And I guess the law enforcement institution, the PNP itself, has not only been doing this as the way they are expecting us to do. We also have some kind of human activities, like for example, during rescue operations, we have been extending a lot of relief kind of work where the police has been quite visible. We happen to be the most visible government at work, especially during time of calamities. And this, I guess, is something that we must also include in the narrative of ensuring the protection of human rights. But every so often, we are always being equated with violations of human rights. It is as if we have not done anything right for the Filipino communities. And we actually have been pushing reforms as well. Of course, our leaders come and go, but the programs are still in place. Even our manuals in human rights have already been integrated in our system. under no circumstances where courses are being conducted without human rights subjects. And the Philippine National Police, especially the 215,000 strong police forces, have matured enough to understand how it works with regard to protecting the best interests of our people, along
Yes,
with
sir.
the
Well-
protection of human rights.
Yes, sir. Well, certainly, sir. We don't. We're not asking you to speak on behalf of the president. But what I did want to ask you was that how are you as a policeman, and how is the PNP as an institution able to reconcile those two apparently conflicting viewpoints? On one hand, as you said, nga, and the fact that you have a human rights office, the PNP as an institution respects and upholds the concepts of human rights. But on the other hand, the commander-in-chief repeatedly and very, very publicly attacks the concepts of human rights every once in a while. So, ayun lang po, how do policemen reconcile those two things? Is there even a need to reconcile those two things?
Well, in public, you may have heard the president saying this thing, and I guess from our end, he would also tell us to do what is right. And that is how the president seems to be projecting himself, and the people seem to be, you know, used to having our president do this. And for about almost 5 years, we have seen a president that is quite sincere in perhaps speaking his mind, and we give it to him. But as far as the PNP is concerned, he always has been telling us just comply what is in the rules. You just have to enforce the law without fear or favor. You just have to make sure that in the performance of your duties, the rules of procedures need to be followed and all that. I guess he has never abandoned actually as a lawyer those that actually have to be understood from the perspective of law enforcement. And the PNP is, of course, being the premier law enforcement institution of the land, has to comply what the laws provide. And we cannot get away from the fact that in as much as our commander-in-chief telling us what needs to be done, then I guess we have nothing to worry about anything that comes out of his mouth. We just have to still comply with what the rules provide us.
Si General Bato de la Rosa, he started off lang tokang. He was asked kung ano yung pagkakamali niya in carrying out the war on drugs. And sabi niya, one of his regrets was not cleansing the PNP first, which led to abuses. And ngayong gabi, we just talked to Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch, and he pointed out that only one case of abuse in the war on drugs has led to conviction. I think he was referring to the Kian de los Santos case. Kumusta po yung mga cases involving deaths under investigation connected to the war on drugs? Ilan na ba yung may mga arestado ba? Would you be aware of the numbers, or would you have a ballpark figure? Saka kumusta na status nila in court?
Well, the Department of Justice has taken the helm of conducting investigations. It's a panel investigation, actually. But insofar as what has happened to those perhaps cases that may have been doubted as bordering on violations of human rights, we cannot practically expect that for every time our police officers conduct operations, especially on anti-illegal drugs, there would be automatic investigation from the criminal point of view. We always have that presumption of regularity on their part. For after all, the PNP is open to accommodating any and all complaints that may be leveled against the families of the suspects of in illegal drugs operations. But at the end of the day, we have known how the people have reacted every time we are really winning the war against those who are bent on destroying communities. And we are referring to the war on drugs. We have to understand as well that across the entire country, much progress has been done. And the people actually have appreciated what we have been doing. We also have our own share of deaths in our police ranks. And we hope our people should also understand that it's not as if we are taking a picnic in fighting those involved in illegal drugs. And it has not been completed yet. The war is not over, but we will not let up all these things because what we are more conscious about is the future of our nation, the future of our children. And if there are some of the things that we have perhaps done, bordering on what is wrong, again, as I was saying, the PNP does not condone this kind of acts that are inimical to the service itself.
Are there ongoing programs to strengthen the internal affairs service and the the capabilities of the PNP for scientific criminal investigation? I mean, strengthening the laboratory facilities, for example, DNA testing, things we watch on TV, I guess.
Well, the Internal Affairs Service is conducting motu proprio administrative investigation, ma'am. Of course, what we hope to accomplish here is, because we're talking about human rights, there is always the due process that dictates upon us to generate the required pieces of evidence for us to convict any of our erring police officers. Be that as it may, we know that despite difficulties in investigation, even including asking those witnesses to come out in the open, the police officers know too well that the PNP has this system of perhaps imposing sanctions over any erring police officers, especially those in illegal drugs operations. You have also found a number of operations done by police officers where we were able to arrest those colleagues of theirs that have been involved in this kind of illegal acts. So you can see the sincerity of the PNP itself as being responsible enough to run after any individuals, including those police officers who may have been committing violations of law, especially as far as illegal drugs are concerned.
Yung laboratory facilities, General, is it being upgraded? Are they being upgraded for scientific criminal investigation?
Well, our Chief PNP himself, in fact, has taken the helm in ensuring that our crime laboratory will have been added with several equipment, not only here in the crime laboratory in Kamkrami, but also across the other regions. And he has also taken the helm of ensuring that the training of our professionals, those chemists, those involved in scene of the crime operations, have also had these training activities, not only here, but also abroad. And of course, the equipment that we need may be brought down to the provinces, and this is something that we are lacking of. But we can only hope that across time, the Congress would provide us enough budget in order for us to procure all these necessary equipment to improve our scientific way of getting the evidence needed.
Sir, if I may, I'd like to ask you about a particular case that happened today. We don't have much detail of it yet, so you might be able to help us here and find out what really happened. We understand that earlier this morning, an editor was arrested by the PNP CIDG. We're talking about Miss Lady Ann Salem of the media group Manila Today. I think it's an online publication. She was arrested in a wave of arrests done by the CIDG that also included 6 other people, and the other people were, I understand, for example, trade unionists. Now, Lady Ann Salem belongs to a group, Manila Today, which is one group that was red tagged by officials earlier on. So they were being linked to the New People's Army, CPP, NPA, NDF. Do we have any information on her arrest and why she was arrested, and so on down the line?
Well, at this point, our officer has not obtained most substantive information in regard to the arrests made by the CIG and other units concerned. But what we got is that they had obtained first the search warrant, and maybe other warrants may already have been issued even prior to the the execution of the operations. And therefore, the presumption of regularity is there. And we hope that once the case is filed, all the pieces of evidence that actually been gathered. Of course, the other party, the other side could also claim that certain violations may have been committed. And again, we are open to accommodating any of these complaints. But for now, we give it to the authorities. We give it to the CIDG that is also familiar with the procedures that they have to follow. And they also need to obtain the witnesses who could also help out in ensuring that the procedures really are being given the kind of treatment that it deserves. So all these things, all these factors are integrated into making our police officers effective and efficient in carrying out their tasks. Of course, there would be reactions, especially from the other side, but because of our law enforcement functions, we just have to perform our duties. There are search warrants. The court actually has decided that indeed these warrants be issued. Of course, the pieces of evidence, the judges had to probe some of the things needed by examining from the witnesses all the things that are necessary for him to issue the search warrant. So I guess the CIDG has had all the things sort of making them operate with success. And that's the reason all these arrests were made.
Yes, so you're saying, sir, that the raid on her house was covered by a search warrant issued by a judge.
That's right, sir.
Yes, sir. But for a judge to issue a search warrant, I suppose there has to be a reason stated in that search warrant as to what the police are looking for. Do we know what that was?
Well, we give it to the investigators, of course, but basically it has something to do with the campaign against loose firearms. And there are some witnesses who may have had the idea where these firearms are located. So true enough, that is what happened. And we do not want to perhaps compromise any of what the people were saying just for them to get away from the crime. So still, at the end of the day, we have to file the action, and all the evidence that we had gathered would serve as basis of the court to consider maybe if the evidence is enough to place the suspects behind bars.
General, isang pahabulang na question, tinatanong ng Presidente, what happened daw to the truncheons, yung mga batuta ng pulis, hindi na ginagamit?
Actually, ma'am, yung truncheons po are part of the uniform of the Philippine National Police personnel. It's just that when this is now being used purposely to address the social distancing requirement, iba po ang naging perspective ng ilang quarters, especially mga human rights groups, because it might be used as instrument to commit, again, certain violations. But of course, our police officers are familiar with the use of these truncheons. And there is a continuum force, we call this force continuum, where maybe we could just start with pakiusap, and then eventually it will evolve into warning, and then fines, or imprisonment in the context of ordinances being enforced by the police, or both. But eventually, if the individuals concerned would commit a more aggressive act, then under no circumstances or under no compunction, the police officers would also react accordingly by using the instrument, truncheon itself, instead of maybe pulling out his gun. And that will be more difficult or more dangerous on the part of the lowly individuals.
So hindi pala na-retire yung batuta pala, hindi pala. It's there.
Nananatili pa rin po siyang instrumento po. Ini-issue po ito sa mga kapulisan. And usually, nangyayari po yan sa mga crowd disturbance and all.
Okay. Brigadier General Ildebrandi Usana, spokesperson for the PNP. Thank you for joining the chiefs. Good evening po, General.
Salamat po, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
God bless po. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay. And that'll be all for this lonely edition of the Chiefs. Dalawa lang tayo.
Oh my, Human Rights Day edition.
We hope what was discussed here will keep the conversation going. I'm Edling of One News.
I'm Ami Paminton of the Philippine Star, and we are One News.